Good morning, dear colleagues. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Daniela Knoppig, and I work with UNICEF's Migration and Displacement Hub. And I also represent UNICEF and ICAT. I'm very excited to be leading you through today's webinar, where we will dive deeper into data analysis and triangulation. And we'll be specifically looking at the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, GLOTIP, and the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery, the GEMS initiative. Before I hand over to our excellent speakers, let me just say a few words about ICAT and the webinar series for those of you that are joining us for the very first time. So as many of you know, ICAT stands for the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. ICAT is a United Nations mandated policy forum for coordination and cooperation on preventing and combating trafficking in persons. And the group operates under the continuous overall support of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. ICAT has an overall plan of actions that is focused on 6 priority areas. And one of these looks at building an evidence base on trafficking in persons. And while the group's annual activities under the plan of action are shaped by its chairs, which are elected on an annual basis, we have 2 co-chairs for ICAT this year, who are the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, SRSG-VAC. As part of their co-chairing work plan for this year, they are focusing, among other things, on promoting data innovations and providing thematic guidance on research on trafficking in persons. So with this webinar series, ICAT is aiming to do just that. In the year, we have a total of 6 webinars in the series, 2 of which took place already earlier this summer and which some of you may have attended. They were focused on developing trafficking in persons research questions and pioneering initiatives on leveraging trafficking data. The series will be running all the way through November 2023, and we have a few exciting topics coming up that are looking at, for example, data collection tools and data visualization, to looking at research gaps and research dilemmas. So without further ado, let me please invite our very first speaker. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Fabrizio Sarica to come in. Dr. Sarica is the team leader for UNODC research on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. And he has been leading the research of the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, the GLOTIP, since its very first edition in 2009. He'll be sharing with us insights into data collection, analysis, and triangulation methodologies used for the GLOTIP. So over to you, Dr. Fabrizio.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniela. So I would like to cover a couple of issues during these 10-15 minutes. One is about the data and the methodology that we use in the global report, and one example of a result, and then a note also on the next edition of the global report, the next edition that will be published in 2024. The previous edition of the report was published in 2022, and the reason is, of course, we publish a global report every 2 years because we were told by the General Assembly to do so. The Global Report on Trafficking in Persons is mandated by the General Assembly as part of the United Nations Global Plan of Action in 2010. Paragraph 60 of this resolution ask UNODC to collect and report every 2 years on trafficking persons, at national, regional, and international level, and to focus on trafficking patterns and trafficking flows. So it's clear that the General Assembly, the member states, give us a mandate for an analytical report. So we want to enhance knowledge, understand, grasp what are the trafficking characteristics, trafficking patterns, and trafficking. So we are collecting data on yearly basis. The source of information are national institutions around the world that are mandated to identify victims of trafficking in person. So over the years, we have compiled a very large data set on trafficking persons. As we speak, we are collecting data. So we sent out our questionnaires already, I think, at the beginning of May, and we will send again a new set of questionnaires with next May 2024. So we currently have information that goes back to the year 2003. 2003 is the year of the entry into force of the Trafficking Persons Protocol. So we have been collecting data since then. And our dataset contains information about 500,000 victims of trafficking persons that have been detected globally. They've been detected by national institutions in more than 140 countries around the world. We ask about their profile, about the age, sex, and citizenship, forms of exploitations, and the same information are asked about the offenders, about the suspected traffickers or traffickers that have been identified and convicted. So traffickers that are investigated, traffickers being prosecuted and convicted. And also in this case, we ask for the main characteristics of the traffickers. Beyond that, we, as a part of our data collection, we also ask national authorities to send us cases, the narrative of cases of trafficking persons that are concluded with a conviction. So over the years, we have collected about 800 cases. Actually, as I said, information is flowing as we speak. So we are currently 850, about 850 cases. And these 850 cases also contains quite a few numbers of information about victims and trafficking. Those cases tell us about beyond information beyond the cold statistics, beyond the cold information about the profile of the victim. Tell us about, of course, the relation between the traffickers and the victims, of the vulnerability of the victims, the structure of the criminal networks, and so forth. So it really gives us a lot of qualitative information that we are able to use in the analysis of our global report. In the link below, you can find a link for to our global report. So the methodology of the global report is an analytical interpretation of a large number of detected cases of trafficking persons. When I say a large number, every year we have information, we collect information about new victims that have been detected for that year, and the information is on about 50,000 victims detected per year. So on the basis of these objective facts, of course, we are aware that being the core unit of analysis that detected cases of trafficking, this information has limits. This information only tells us about the cases that came to light, and that information has biases because the national institutions, whether they are the criminal justice systems, whether they are the social assistance, or whether they are those NGOs that have, so to say, let's say, the assignment by national authorities of assisting victims, have also some biases. So this information may focus on certain forms of trafficking, and or let's say focus on a certain profile of the victim. So we are aware of that, but having this solid information, having these facts, and on the basis of the cases, on the possible limits and the possible biases, we try to draw some conclusions that make sense. The information that we receive from national authorities is not taken as such, is not taken as face value. Most of the 2 years work for the completion of the production of the global report is about validating the data and this and triangulating the data. So this validation is done literature review, talking to experts, and our national focal points, UNODC experts around the world, are key for this purpose. So we are in constant contact with our trafficking persons focal point in Africa, in Central America, and we try to talk to them and to understand, okay, we have received this information from this country that is under your geographical competence. So what you tell me, what's the point of this data? And we can receive the feedback, oh, look, member states, this country have changed legislation recently, or have included a national action plan more recently, or is giving less resources to trafficking units because of many reasons. So the information is reliable, is less reliable, or is biased in this sense or in this other sense. So on the basis of this information and this validation process, then we can disregard some information or try to interpret the data that we receive in a certain so I like to give one example of the analysis and we have conducted and presented in the global report on trafficking persons. So this is a chart that is presenting the core let's say, result on the analysis on trafficking persons. Who are the victims of trafficking? So who are the victims of trafficking and how the profile of the victim of trafficking changed over the years? Well, what we can say is who are the detected victims of trafficking. This information, of course, should be handled carefully. In the year 2004, most of the victims that were detected at the time were adult women trafficked for sexual exploitation. 74% were adult women, then we have 10% of girls. A very limited number of the victims detected were actually males. So this profile has changed, as you can see in this chart. In 2020, we have 42% of the victims detected globally adult women. So a drastic reduction that has continued over the years. So how can we interpret this? Is this changing patterns in trafficking in persons? Maybe, but there is, of course, a change also in the institutional capacity and focus over the years. So it's clear that while in the year 2004, sexual exploitation was the main form of trafficking, as also on the overall idea of national institutions. Over the years, national institutions have been focusing more and more on trafficking in persons for the purpose of forced labor and trafficking in persons of males. More and more it was, let's say, internalized by national institutions that also males can be victims of trafficking. As a consequence, these results, and this is how we present it in our global report, shows not only a change in patterns in the trafficking in persons, but also a change in attitude of national authorities in tackling trafficking persons. But I want to go beyond that. So who are the victims of trafficking persons beyond the cold, let's say, statistics on the age and sex profiles? Who are in terms of vulnerability? So on the basis of the analysis of those 800 cases screened and that we have collected over the years, we had we looked at the vulnerability. What was the vulnerability, main vulnerability of the victim before being targeted by traffickers? Very often this information is reported in the case narrative that at least that we have received by national authorities. Well, in 51% of the cases, the victim was in economic need, so was looking for a job, the family was in extreme poverty, or the person was kind of trying to improve the economic situation. So 51% is quite an important pattern, and it's not an exception. So 51% is when the core vulnerability for trafficking victims before being targeted by traffickers. So this means also that deterioration, this would lead us to think that deterioration in the economic situation of a country would increase the risks for trafficking in persons. And this is the analysis that came afterwards. So in this chart, we have, that is very nicely also, let's say, from the graphic, from the visual point of view, we have compared the unemployment rates in Bulgaria, the orange line in the chart, and the number, the share actually, of Bulgarian victims detected in the Netherlands. So information is coming from two different sources. Unemployment in Bulgaria is coming from the National Economic Authority in Bulgaria. The blue line is coming from the Dutch authorities about victims that have been detected and the nationality of these victims. So you see that when unemployment goes up in Bulgaria, we see more Bulgarian victims detected in the destination countries, in the Netherlands, normally after one year. Unemployment goes down in Bulgaria, we see less Bulgarian victims detected in the Netherlands, and so forth. So on the basis of a analysis, multilinear analysis that we have conducted on the data on, again, detected cases of trafficking persons, we were able to arrive to a predictor of trafficking persons. This is one of the few predictors that we have out there, that is unemployment. So in the future, when unemployment rates will go up again in Bulgaria, we could have and raise a red flag. Look, be careful, because out there, this unemployment, increasing unemployment rates in the country of origin may result into more trafficking in person. So this is how we use, of course, the information that we collect. I'd like to close just with one note. On the next edition of the Global Report, we are conducting an online survey for NGO. It's very important to us. We want to create this NGO barometer and we are collecting information about the needs that NGO supporting victims of trafficking in persons have. So we would like to hear your voice. You can participate to the online survey at the link. You can find it at the link below. And please tell us your view. And with this, I give back the floor to Daniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarika. You've given us a lot of food for thought, including on how you take into consideration the biases in data collection, and then reflections on changing patterns and changing capacity. And of course, super helpful to have an example of how you're triangulating data, for example, now on unemployment in Bulgaria and trafficking flows to the Netherlands, which I think gives us a lot of important insights also for the prevention work. Next, I would like to introduce our two presenters for the next segment. So Dr. Michaela de Kock has been a leading researcher for the ILO on methodologies to survey and estimate child labor, forced labor, and trafficking of adults and children for the last 20 years. And she currently works as the head of the research and evaluation unit in ILO's Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work branch. She has been actively involved in key ILO global estimates on child labor and on forced labor since the very first estimate in 2002 until the recent global estimates on modern slavery, which was just released last September. Dr. Michaela has also been developing a series of national surveys on forced labor and trafficking of adults and children, which have led to estimates that were published in national reports and to the development of the guidelines on measurement of forced labor, which were endorsed by the International Conference on Labor Statistics in October 2018. And Dr. Michaela is joined today by Elise Gordon, who is Manager of Global Research at Walk Free. Walk Free is an international human rights organization working to eradicate all forms of modern slavery. And Elise's focus is on developing a greater understanding of the extent of modern slavery using nationality representative surveys. Elise holds a Master of Global Health and has a background in quantitative research method in the fields of public health and social sciences. So we are very excited to have you both with us, and we look forward to learning more about the global estimates of modern slavery, the GEMS initiative. Over to you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think it's a perfect fit to talk after my colleague and friend Fabrizio Sarrica, because we take at the ILO and for the global estimates of modern slavery, we come from, I would say, a culture of household survey to measure forced labor. And this presentation, which is done in collaboration with Walk-Free, with my colleague Elise, will show how it was necessary to use administrative data and data on real victims of trafficking to be able to build this global estimate. So Elise, if you can share. Yes. Thank you. Next slide. So the presentation is not a presentation of the global estimate per se, but more on the methodology. So it's based on it's based on this report that was released in September 22 on this global estimate of modern slavery, which was designed by ILO, Walk-Free and IOM jointly. So the global estimate, just a few words. You may remember we usually say 50 million people in modern slavery at any time, any day of 2021. And this figure is the sum of two sub-estimates, 27.6 million in forced labor and 22 million in forced marriage. And the presentation today and this discussion on the use of triangulation will focus on the 27.6 million in forced labor, which is made of three parts, and that's extremely important. The forced labor exploitation, so people in forced labor in private economy in any sector, apart from the 6.3 million who are in forced commercial sexual exploitation, adults and children, men and women, and the 3.9 million people in what we call state-imposed forced labor. That means that the responsible party is not a private business or private employer, but directly the states. And we will explain jointly with Elise how it was necessary to triangulate and recourse to other data than survey data. Next slide, please. Since the very first ILO estimate on forced labor, 2005, and then again ILO 2012, and then the two global estimates done with Walk-Free and IOM in 2016 and 2021, we have used the same typology, which is here, which maps the data source. This typology is first make the difference between forced labor and forced marriage for modern slavery. And for forced labor, we distinguish the forms of forced labor which are imposed by the states and those imposed in the private economy, whether it's in sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation, or forced labor exploitation. This is not only for data sources, although this is what I'm going to focus on, but also for policy response. You know that we do global estimate to inform the international communities and advise on policy response. We also use the same typology whenever we do estimate at national level. So it's important to have this in mind. It's mainly for policy response, and it happened that the data sources that are available for these various forms of forced labor match the typology. So for I will start not following the graph exactly, but to focus on the forced labor exploitation of adults. For that, we knew by experience of 20 years that we could capture reliably data on forced labor through household surveys. So along with Work3, we did commission GLOTIP to run national surveys in 68 countries and use the ILO statistical definition approved by what we call ICLS, the Conference of Labor Statisticians, which is made of all ILO member states, who approved a statistical definition of forced labor that matched the legal definition. And these surveys, the questionnaire was designed to capture elements of involuntary work and coercion, as per the definition, for the respondent and their family network. We knew that we could have this information about forced labor of adults in the private sectors. So this is the arrow that you see in national survey for adults in forced labor. But we knew from experience that through household surveys, we cannot capture information about state-imposed forced labor because household surveys, by definition, do not cover anything but households. So in particular, if there is forced labor in prisons or in military camps, that is outside the scope of these surveys. Therefore, for the type of forced labor, which is forced labor imposed by the state, we had to rely on other sources. In that case, we did rely on the comments of the committee of experts from the ILO, which review every year reports sent to them on the application of Convention 29 and 105 on forced labor, specifically in that case on the cases imposed by the state. We had to complement these ILO sources by other UN public sources on the extent of this phenomenon. Now I go back to forced labor imposed by private economy, because you see out of the 4 boxes below, forced commercial of sexual exploitation of adults and children, forced labor exploitation of adults of children, national surveys only provide data for one of the 4 boxes. Why? Through household surveys, we know, and all of us who have done research on this topic know that we cannot capture reliable information about forced commercial sexual exploitation of adults and children through a household survey, especially if the respondent is invited to answer for their family network. So instead of having, let's say, a biased result or unreliable result, we decided that we needed some other sources. And then we turned to IOM CTDC database of administrative data of the victims of trafficking who have been identified and assisted either by IOM or other organizations which contribute to CTDC, where we had the sex, gender, age group, type of exploitation, and region. That was the elements we needed for our estimate. Similarly, for forced labor exploitation of children through household surveys, because the definition is more complex, we could not capture it, and we also had to turn to this other source, CTDC, database. So you see, from the typology, not talking about forced marriage, but even on forced labor only, we had to use various sources. I now turn to Elise, who will explain how we did it.
Thanks very much, Mikhail. I won't go into too much depth because Mikhail's already covered a bit of it, but just to provide a little bit more detail on the national surveys. So they were conducted in 68 countries between 2017 and 2021, and they were implemented by Gallup as part of their World Poll. They were household-based surveys, and they collected data on forced labour and forced marriage. And they asked respondents to report on their own experiences as well as the experiences of their immediate family. So that's parents, children, siblings, and spouse. Prior to the pandemic, all surveys were conducted face-to-face. And then following the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the mode of fielding switched to telephone interviewing. And surveys were based on a probability sample, and they represented the resident, civilian, non-institutionalized population aged 15 and over. We conduct a minimum of 1,000 interviews per survey country, and that brought us to a total sample size of almost 78,000 primary respondents. And then when including the entire family network, the sample size was expanded to over 628,000 people. So just in terms of the analysis of adult forced labour, for a case in line with the International Labour Organization definition of forced labour, for a person to be identified as an adult victim of forced labour exploitation in the past 5 years, so that's the reference period for the global estimates 2017 to 2021, they had to report that the work was involuntary, there was menace of penalty, the type of work they were forced to do, and that they were aged 18 or over at the time of exploitation. The survey results were expanded first to national estimates by applying survey weights to the sample, and they were calculated based on the design of the survey. The weights were then adjusted for response type, so either self-response or proxy response, with a proxy response being a report by the respondent on the experience of their immediate family member. And this was to account for the response bias that occurs due to the tendency for people reporting on their own experiences to be more accurate than when talking about the experiences of family members. So we gave more importance or more weight to self-responses relative to proxy responses. And then the national estimates were used to impute values for countries for which national surveys had not been conducted. And we used a weighted linear model to do this. And the model included covariates consisting of geographic variables and a variable in the number of international migrant workers in the country. And then a little bit more on the CT-DC trafficking data that was used. As Mikhail has already mentioned, there were an insufficient number of cases of forced commercial sexual exploitation and commercial sexual exploitation of children identified through the national surveys. So we use the CT-DC dataset, which includes case data collected by IOM and its partners in the process of assisting victims of human trafficking. And the dataset comprises cases of both trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation as well as labour exploitation. And it includes information on the profile of the victims, such as age and sex, as well as on the trafficking situation. So, for example, the country of exploitation and the means of control. And so while the total dataset comprised over 156,000 records at the time of analysis, to be eligible for inclusion, a record needed to be a case of trafficking for either commercial sexual exploitation or labour exploitation. The victim had to have had first contact with the service provider in the reference period of the global estimate. There we no missing data on sex and age group, so child or adult, and country of exploitation was known and was within the scope of the ILO countries and territories for the global estimation. So in total, over 42,600 records from the CT-DC dataset were included in the analysis of forced commercial sexual exploitation of adults and children and forced labour of children. And so the way we went about measuring forced commercial sexual exploitation of adults was to calculate the odds of falling victim to forced commercial sexual exploitation relative to forced labour exploitation for different demographic characteristics of of the population. We then used those odds ratios to estimate the number of victims of forced commercial sexual exploitation based on estimates of forced labour derived from the national surveys. So to give a bit more detail, this approach had 3 key steps. So 1, to decide on the most appropriate statistical model to estimate the odds ratios of forced commercial sexual exploitation to forced labour exploitation. And this was done separately for adults and children using the CTDC dataset. And the models examined for estimation of the odds ratios were specified as logit regressions for binary outcomes with 2 variables. They were sex and age group, so child or adult, as well as the interaction between age group and sex. In the next step of the estimation, the estimated parameters of the logit model were used to calculate the odds ratios of falling victim of forced commercial sexual exploitation relative to forced labour exploitation. And then finally, these odds ratios were applied to the corresponding regional estimates of forced labour exploitation of adults derived from the national surveys. So obviously that's a lot of odds ratios and parameters and things like that, but just I guess to sort of give a bit of an example. So for example, the estimate of the number of female adult victims of forced commercial sexual exploitation in Africa was obtained by multiplying the corresponding odds ratio for female adults with the survey estimate of the number of female adult victims of forced labour exploitation in Africa. And it should also be noted that the odds ratios are applied to the stock estimates of forced labour exploitation of adults. And that doesn't adjust for the difference in the average duration of forced commercial sexual exploitation relative to that of forced labour exploitation. And that was really to keep the model as simple as possible and also maintain consistency with the methodology used in the last edition of the GEMS. And this is, I'll whip through because I realise we're short on time, but this is really just to illustrate how the estimates of the parameters in the final logit model were used to derive the odds ratios for female and male victims, adults and children victims, which is shown in the bottom table there. And the odds ratios in the last column of the table are greater than 1 for children and smaller than 1 for adults. And so this means that children, whether boys or girls, are more likely to fall victim of forced commercial sexual exploitation than forced labour exploitation. And then by contrast, adults, particularly men, are more likely to fall victim of forced labour exploitation than forced commercial sexual exploitation. And said in another way, just referring to that third row that's highlighted there, that line indicates that for every 100 boys aged under 18 years of age who were victims of forced labour exploitation, there are about 135 others who were victims of forced commercial sexual exploitation. And then just to end on our analysis of forced labour of children and commercial sexual exploitation of children. So this a similar approach was used to obtain these estimates, except that the model estimated the odds of that a victim of forced labour exploitation is a child relative to that of being an adult. So that was the first step to estimate the odds ratio for forced labour of children. And those resulting odds ratios were applied to the global and regional estimates of forced labour exploitation of adults derived from the national surveys. And then the final step was to use these estimates to derive the corresponding estimates of forced commercial sexual exploitation of children using the odds ratios calculated from the logit model for forced commercial sexual exploitation versus forced labour exploitation. So again, you can see in these tables, the top table there shows the calculations of the odds ratios, and then the bottom table shows how these were applied to get the estimates of forced labour exploitation of children and forced commercial sexual exploitation of children. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Michaela and Elise. I see we have the chat or the Q&A on fire. And the first question I would like to direct to Dr. Fabrizio. It's from Alexandra Donskova-Huber from OSCE, who is asking, do you collect data disaggregated by type of exploitation on offenders as well, or just on victims? Over to you.
Yes, we do collect that information, and unfortunately, the level of response at the moment was never enough to come up with an analysis on that specific core indicators, but we hope to use it in the future. Yes.
Thank you very much. I see we also have a follow-up question for Dr. Michaela and Elise is around the GEMS and clarifying whether the GEMS does not contain nationally representative data and therefore cannot be extrapolated to produce absolute numbers of people in modern slavery per country.
So I may answer. Yes, the purpose of this survey is to build the global estimates, and the sample sizes and the margins of the confidence interval that we present in the global estimate is based on this assumption that we compute only global estimate and regional estimates for forced labor of adults only. That's how it's used, and that's why we don't publish national estimates in the global estimate. And actually, through the methodology, we don't go through any national estimate. They are pulled together to be directly the global estimates.
And if I can just add to Mikhail's response, the sampling of the 68 national surveys is designed to be nationally representative. However, it's just that we don't collect sufficient sample sizes to be able to produce reliable national estimates. So the sample scheme is designed to be nationally representative, just to clarify that.
Thank you, Elise. Maybe as a follow-up question to Elise and Dr. Michaela, I'd also like to know, do you use triangulation of data beyond what you had presented today?
Yes, from ILO side, a lot. But for the global estimate, let me take another example, which is duration. You know, it's extremely important on forced labor. And again, I am a researcher, but we do this work for policymakers, for people who implement programs to combat forced labor and trafficking. It's extremely important to know how long people have been victims of forced labor. So this is what we call the duration, how long the situation has lasted. It's an indicator also at national level when we do national surveys on, I would say, the efficiency of law enforcement and detection approach. You know, it's better to release people after 2 days in forced labor than 2 years. So this is an extremely important indicator. In the case of the global estimate, we have the question on duration in the surveys. So we ask people, when did the situation start and when it ended? And if people were still in forced labor, we did take the date of the survey as the end date. And we did compute an average duration by type of exploitation. But in order to validate and to see whether it made sense, we did compare that with the data which are on the same topic in CTDC database. You know, when IOM shelters a victim of trafficking, or when there is a case identified by IOM, they ask about the starting date and the release date. And we did compare duration by various gender type of exploitation and triangulate to validate the result from the global estimate. So that's a simple example.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michaela. I see we have one follow-up question, which I'd like to direct to Elise. One of the participants was asking about the difference between forced CSE and CSE, if you could come in on that.
Certainly, yes. So we use forced commercial sexual exploitation to refer to adults who are that element of force is required, whereas commercial sexual exploitation, we tend to refer children. We don't use the term force when commercial sexual exploitation is of children, given that their age means that the force it's not required. It's forced regardless. They're not of an age to consent. And I don't know if Michaela, if you want to add to that, but that just to say that sometimes it is used a little bit interchangeably, but adult forced commercial sexual exploitation, has the force.
Dr. Michaela, would you want to add?
Yeah, any kind of sexual exploitation of children is forced. So that's why we don't use it. We call it about sexual exploitation.
Thank you so much for clarifying. I see we have a few more questions that came in. First of all, there was a question from Alexandra from OSCE directed at Dr. Fabrizio, and she is asking, do you consider being a representative of a national minority as a vulnerability factor? Over to you, Dr. Fabrizio.
Thank you. The vulnerability is, of course, quite a wide concept. What we collect, for us, it's an open question, so to say. So we see what is indicated as vulnerability. It could be everything. Could be exactly being part of a minority, could be being discriminated, could be being an irregular migrant, or could be in economic need. It's so we just collect that specific information from the cases, and then we will see what it is. So anything could be vulnerability for us, as long as it is mentioned in the case that we receive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I see there was another question that was looking at the GEMS report in comparison to the Global Slavery Index report by Walk Free. Elise, would you want to come in on that?
Yes, certainly. So the Global Slavery Index is solely the work of Walk Free, but it does relate to the GEMS in that the regional estimates presented in the GEMS form the starting point for the national estimates in the Global Slavery Index. So it means we have a unified sort of counts of regional and global counts of modern slavery. They're aligned with the GEMS, but then we use our own methodology to break that down at the national level using a risk modeling approach.
Thank you very much, Elise. I see we have one more question around data collection that I'd like to direct to Dr. Michaele, and that is looking at IOM are collecting data based on specific indicators, and the participant is wondering, do ILO align their studies with those or collaborate based on sample from specific geographical targets? Over to you, Dr. Michaele.
The global estimates, so I'm talking only about global estimate, not ILO work. For the global estimate, the objective is to get global figures, global and regional figures. Hence, the household surveys that we do commission are a sample of the whole world. The 68 countries cover all regions. Now, when we do the odds ratio with CTDC IOM database, there is a bias, and this is presented as a limitation of the current estimate on some regions which are less covered or over-covered in CTDC. There was one source of data in CTDC which is limited to US, and we had to do a special treatment not to have an over-representation of this case. The objective for the future is really to make sure that the use of admin data cover the full world, similarly to the household surveys. So that's something we are working on now for the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Michaela. So to close, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time today to participate in the third webinar of the series on trafficking in persons, data and research. I would, of course, also like to thank our excellent speakers, Dr. Fabrizio Sarica, Dr. Michaela de Kock, and Elise Gordon for their presentations and for answering all the questions and all the additional materials that are provided to advance the discussion. Last but not least, I would also like to thank all of the ICAT members for promoting the webinar, and to the UNODC Secretariat and the NOTS Tech team for the support throughout this session, and our two 2023 co-chairs, IOM and SRS GVAC, for spearheading this interesting initiative. Thank you again for your participation today. Have a lovely day. Take care.